So first I want to say thank you, everyone. Just make sure I'm sharing my screen here. Can everyone see my screen? Can you see my screen now? Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is talk about how equity and inclusion can lead to real business impact. So just to introduce myself, my name is Carmen Brooms, and I am lead UX researcher at Handshake. And so for some of you who don't know what Handshake is, it is a platform to help students discover their career path and find jobs. And it also is a platform where students in particular, or early career, people who are interested in early career can actually establish relationships with employers that could be lasting throughout their career process.
Carmen, we're just seeing your desktop. We still don't see the presentation.
Oh,
sorry.
Okay. I'm so sorry. This is the weirdest morning. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, thank you for interrupting. Okay, how is that?
That's it.
All right, we're gonna try it one more time. This is fun. Can't share this morning. All right, thank you for saying something. And let's see if I can keep an eye on chat just in case anything happens. Okay, so I'm not gonna keep going through this over and over again, so I'll just move on to the next slide. So just to backtrack a little bit. So what I'm gonna be talking about is how equity and inclusion can be used as a true discipline in the user-centered design process and the software development process. So many of you are probably very familiar with that process and how it works. But equity inclusion is actually no longer a nice to have. It's no longer a human resource function. It is actually becoming an important part of the discipline of how we practice software development and how we practice user experience and build products today. And companies are starting to see the value of that. They understand the value and they understand that it actually leads to real business impact for several reasons. Because customers really want to work for companies. Well, I should say employees really want to work for companies that value equity and inclusion. So they understand that value, but they also understand customers. Customers want to come to companies that have this value system too. And they want to know that companies are making an effort of really thinking about how about using qualitative insights. So really deeply understanding who your customer is, and also quantitative analysis. So digging deep into the data, understanding how your customers are behaving on your platform. What are they interacting with? What are they not interacting with? And then coupling that with qualitative user insights to understand the why behind things. So why are people doing it? So it might be okay to understand, well, they're not clicking this button or they're not interacting with this part of your product or your website, but you don't necessarily understand why. So it's really important to put together both data and the why behind things. And the other aspect is stakeholder interviews. So it is so important to understand your leadership's strategy, your executive strategy, and where they're trying to take the business. Does that even line up with how your customers are behaving on the platform? Does it line up with what you're seeing in the data? And is there opportunity to influence that behavior to take the business in the direction that your stakeholders or your executive team or the business actually wants to take it? So next I'm going to talk about interviewing your stakeholders and what that might look like. So the way I typically go about this is I will have one-on-one interviews with different members of the executive team or different members it could be the product team, but we're basically talking about people that are strategically deciding what they want the product to become or do, what features need to be in the product. So here are just some example questions that might include that I have included in interview stakeholders. So what do they already know about their users? What do they think their users are like? What do they understand about their users? And what don't they know? And I think it's important to understand both. Are there things that they don't necessarily know about their users that they think that they should, or they feel that they would be more effective if they did know? Who's actually paying for their product? And I think that's an important one, because who stakeholders may want to pay for their product may not actually be the one that's actually doing it. And so I'll talk about it a little bit later, but this is where understanding what's happening in your data and what's happening, what your stakeholders actually want, may be the same or it may be different. And who do they think probably would never pay for their product? Who do they think is not their target customer and they're not trying to target? And sometimes those people actually show up as the people who are interested in the product. So it's very important to keep an eye out on that. What do they know about how the people are using their product? So what do they think they understand about the data? And this is probably the most important one that I typically ask in stakeholder interviews is, where do they want to be in 1 to 3 years? Where are they trying to get? Because that really helps to understand how you, as a UX researcher, could help influence behavior on the platform. So next, what you really want to do is take time to examine your data. And depending on your role in the company, is going to depend on whether you have access to this data. So typically not everyone has access, but there's someone in your company that does. And so how can you seek out and find those people and find those teams and partner with them so you can understand the data? And sometimes you may get data and you don't necessarily know what it means or is look for bias and anomalies. So later I'll talk a lot about bias and what that means. So what matches up to what you've heard from stakeholders? What doesn't match up? What patterns are you seeing? Are you finding anything that might be surprising? And it seems like I just want to make sure that everyone can still hear, because we're in this virtual world. It's quite interesting. And so okay, this sound is cutting off occasionally. Okay, great. So we really want to look for bias and anomalies in the data. So is there anything that is surprising when you're looking at the data? Is there anything that really stands out? And I think if you think about us or as Black professionals in this field, we will look at the data very differently than someone else. And I encourage everyone to use that to their advantage. There have been times at companies where I've looked at data because of my own background, and I saw something that someone else didn't see because I have a different lens on someone else. For example, working at Handshake, that we're really caters to college students, me, myself, coming from a historically Black college, I'm going to look at some of the historically Black college data maybe in a different lens than someone that never had that experience. So also don't be afraid of bringing what your experience is and your background to the table when you're looking at this, because you'll be able to look at things differently from someone else. So I did talk earlier about qualitative insights. So it's important part of this process, and somewhat even say probably the most important part of the process is interviewing your users. Really taking out time to do in-depth interviews to understand who your users are, what motivates them, what they're thinking about, and how they're using their product. And I'll talk more about that. So there's a couple of different approaches that you can take to qualitative research. One is an inductive approach, and another is a deductive approach. So at this point in the process, you might already have some hypothesis after having your stakeholder interviews, after looking at the data, you might have some hypothesis. So you might start with a theory, and you might start that way and then do observations and see if that really matches up in your interview process. Or you might not have necessarily developed any theories or hypotheses at this point. So you might start with observation, or you might start with interviews, and then from there do synthesis and analysis to determine what the theory is. But it's important at this point, regardless, is to not make any conclusions at all. So you don't want to make any conclusions at this point, but what you want to try and do is dig deep to understand what your customers are thinking about, how they're using their product, what their motivations are, what their and really, as I mentioned before, dig into the why behind the behaviors. So if you see, you can watch how they use the product. And then from watching how they use the product, understanding why they're interacting with things in such a way. So there's a couple of approaches that I've used in this way. Is I've been able to couple observation with qualitative interviews. And so really digging in and understanding that. And that could be a whole separate topic and a whole separate presentation at some point. So after you've done the qualitative research and you're starting to get a sense from what your stakeholders want and what you're actually seeing as part of your patterns in your data, and you've done interviews. And so now you understand the why behind things, the why, the motivations behind your users. Go back and look at the data again, examine it again. Take another look and see how that all is matching up. Is there anything, again, that is surprising? Is there anything, again, that's matching up? Or is there anything that seems different? And then the next approach that I would recommend is creating a bias cheat sheet. And so there is a long list of bias out there. And you can pull them down anywhere from the internet and have that when you're doing your analysis. So here's a couple of examples of a cheat sheet that you might want to use. So looking at anchoring bias, and we'll talk more about bias in a minute, blind spot bias, and confirmation bias. So as we go through this process, I'm going to talk a lot about bias because we all are biased. And your product is probably biased, has some bias in it too, because we as humans are biased. And so if we're able to use this cheat sheet, or we're able to look and understand bias, then we're better able to understand bias that are occurring in our platform. And we're better able to understand not just how our users may be biased, but how we may be introducing bias in our own analysis, in our own research, or how our stakeholders may be introducing their own bias. So, so just to hunker down or basically drill into bias again, The definition of it is it's the tendency or trend or inclination, excuse me, or opinion, especially one that's preconceived or unreasoned. So most of us think of bias as something that is a negative, and it is a negative in some cases, but later on I'm gonna talk about a couple of areas and opportunity that we could use bias to influence behavior in other ways on the platform too. So you may have seen or you may have heard of different occurrences of bias in product and design and development. So one example, which I don't know if many of you are familiar with, is that for a very long time, cars were built and constructed with male dummies. So weren't necessarily built and constructed with female dummies. Therefore, cars were unsafe or more unsafe for women than they were for men. So you can think about all the implications that may come with this. Women typically have a different body structure than a male. And so when we are not considered in that experience, then cars can, or different things can become even more unsafe for us. So it really wasn't until 2011, or sorry, not 2011. It really wasn't, sorry about that. It really wasn't until much later where cars actually started to be created with dummies, with female dummies in mind. And most of you may be familiar with this. And this occurred with Google, where Google's computer vision system labeled African Americans as gorillas. And there was a couple of posts where people said, my friend is not a gorilla. And this is an example of what we call racial bias, and the previous one was what we would refer to as gender bias. But again, this is an important part of the process of making sure that bias is in, or thinking through bias and understanding bias is integrated into the product design and development process. And it's also important that we, as Black professionals, have a seat at the table. Because if we are there and we are part of the process, then we can recognize these things and we can stop them before they even get to this point. And we all know what it takes in order to build a product. It has to go through a lot of different people, and it has to go through a long process. And when you get to the point of having something released out in the marketplace, and it does things like this, it's very harmful to your brand. It's very harmful to the people using your product. And we understand the way social media works. And it could cost the company money. It could cost the company lawsuits. And so again, this is the reason why companies now are starting to recognize the importance of equity and inclusion in the process, and how that can actually hurt or help revenue. So back to bias and what it really is. So bias is the brain's way of organizing information. It's the brain's attempt to create patterns. So bias is pervasive in product design and development. Because as I mentioned before, we all as humans are biased. So it's not that we're going to ever get rid of bias or remove it, because it will exist, but you definitely don't want things, as the previous example, occurring, such as safety issues with cars for women. So gender bias or racial bias, where we saw in the Google example of African Americans being labeled as gorillas. And bias really can be detrimental, and it really can have rippling effects on society. So in the example of the gender bias, with cars not being created in such a way where cars not being created, that created a huge safety issue. But it can have even more larger ripple effects. And I think, and maybe some of you all can also agree, we see a lot of bias occurring today with what's happening with the pandemic. We've seen it with whether we should wear masks, whether we should not wear masks, whether we should get vaccinated or not get vaccinated. It's played out, and it's played out in a huge way. Does anyone, and I can let people put it into the chat, what kind of bias do you think might be playing out or we might be seeing happening in the pandemic today? Confirmation bias? Yes. Any other thoughts? Vaccination status? Okay. Political bias? Yes. Okay. So there are a couple of types of bias that we see right now happening with the pandemic. And one is belief bias. So people are more likely to accept things if it aligns with their own belief system. So that may override logic. It may override science. It may override any facts that may be coming in because it doesn't necessarily align with their deep belief system. So I think someone mentioned political bias. So political is tied to beliefs and what people's values and belief systems are, which is what someone referred to as that political bias that we're seeing. The other one, and someone mentioned this, is confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is people's tendency for people to favor information that comes from their existing beliefs or hypothesis. So if you start with that belief bias, that it's core to your belief system, it's core to your value system, and then we are in a world of information, right? Where you can go out to the internet, to Twitter, to Facebook, and you can find people, or you can find, in some cases, information that confirms your own belief system. And some of that information may or may not be accurate. So both of these are actually playing out in the pandemic and what's happening and how people are reacting, whether to wear masks, to not wear masks, to get vaccinated, to not get vaccinated. So what are some of the other examples of bias just in general that maybe you've seen play out? And it can be related to the pandemic or just in general. What are some things that you have seen? And you can put it in the chat. Okay, so I am going to talk about, so there, gender equity, yes, definitely. Political, yes. Okay, so there are lots of examples of bias out in the world. And I'm going to talk about a few other things that might be a little bit surprising, is that bias actually can be used for good. So what I mean by that is that there are opportunities where we can flip it on its head. So if bias is everyone has bias and your product is going to have bias, then it's going to be very hard for us to eradicate or completely remove all bias. However, we could flip it on its head where we can use a bias for good in such a way where we can influence behavior in that way. So one example of this is authority bias, which still related to the pandemic. And authority bias is the tendency to attribute greater accuracy to an authority figure and can be more influenced by that opinion. So I'm going to get into this in a minute, but this has played out in a few ways during the pandemic. But one example of this that's actually for good is like the CDC recommendations. So the CDC, what the CDC recommends, that's an authority bias. So the CDC has said, for example, okay, even though you're vaccinated, we still recommend for you to wear a mask at certain, especially if your area is in stage 5. So listening to the CDC and what the CDC has to say, their authority, they said do this, so we should do that. So that's actually a good thing. And that's helpful for society. So that same notion can be used in your product development and your product design process. So on your website, for example, if you're building a website, you can think about what are some opportunities where authority bias or someone who might be of an authority could influence your behaviors to do things for good or to do things in the correct way. Now, of course, that can be used in the opposite direction, right? But we're talking about using it in a good way to influence positive behaviors. The next example of bias being used for good, still related to COVID and the pandemic, is something we call halo effect. So halo effect is people's overall impression of someone's and how they might think about someone in a different area. So think of it this way: somebody's impression of someone influences how they might think about something else. So if someone has a high impression of someone and it has this halo effect, then that influences a completely different area or how they might do something or not do something, depending on that person and what that person says or how that person behaves. So again, we probably have seen both positive and negative impacts of this with the pandemic. But for now, I'm going to talk about how this can be used for good. So an example of this is our Vice President, Kamala Harris. You can see when she got her vaccination, it was out in the media, on social media, it was in the news. And you can see here an African American giving her the vaccination. And so this was used as an opportunity to influence a lot of the Black Americans in the Black population to get vaccinations. So she has this halo effect for some. So showing that, hey, our Vice President, Kamala Harris, got the vaccination, to influence more people in order to get vaccinations. So to kind of break this down a little bit further, most of us are very familiar with the negative impacts of bias and how bias could actually cause companies to lose money, and why it's very important for us to be part of the process. And most of us understand things as racial bias. We may have experienced it before. If you may have experienced gender bias, if you are a woman or a female. So we're very familiar with those common ones. But then there's the other ones that I talked about that we also should become familiar because they do exist on your platform, which is why I talked about creating that cheat sheet so you understand all the ways that bias is playing out. But there is a call to action I'm going to ask everyone because as I mentioned before, you can't completely eradicate bias. We all are going to have bias. So there is an opportunity to take bias and use it for good. Understand that it's going to be there. So how can we develop and design products that actually can use bias in a way, people's innate nature of being biased for good and for an opportunity to influence behaviors in positive directions. So now let's get back to research. Let's talk about that because we talked a little bit about research in the beginning and then I talked about bias. So how are we all putting it together? How does it all interrelate? Well, again, when we're examining qualitative and quantitative insights, we have to do it with the lens of understanding the role that bias is playing in your products, in your users, and your users' behaviors. And the better we understand bias and the better we have a complete understanding of all the different types of bias that are out there, the better we are at recognizing that, which is why starting with that cheat sheet is a great way of getting started. And eventually you may start to be able to understand the long 100 list of bias that exist in the world, and you won't need that cheat sheet anymore. But in the beginning, it's always good to do that because as we report out on insights or we report out on what we're seeing with data, we will report it out with the bias lens. And so you always want to go back and check yourself and understand what bias is occurring here. And what I've done in many of my reports is I put a definition of the bias that I'm seeing. Am I seeing authority bias on the platform? And it might be that I don't know yet if authority bias is even playing a role, but calling that out and saying, hey, I think that there might be authority bias playing here. And so we need to look further into that. And again, that might be a good thing, as I mentioned before, or it could be a negative thing. So being able to put some definition around that. And it also helps to educate your stakeholders, the people that are building the product, whether they're engineers, designers, product managers, it helps them to start to have a language around that because then we are not the only ones that are carrying it. Because what really works is where everyone starts to understand that and everyone is looking out in the same manner. So there is a lot of companies have started to create what they call product equity councils in order to help and assist with that. And product equity councils, it existed at a previous company that I worked for, and it also exists at Handshake. And the beautiful thing about those is it's no longer on its own one person. And us as Black employees is not on us. It makes it so that it is sustainable and it is the work of everyone. And so it's great to create these product equity councils. And what you can do is, and what I think is very important, is to make sure that you have a diverse range of people. And when I say diverse, that includes race, it includes gender, it includes age, it includes where they went to school. So you really want to make sure that you have diverse point of view. But beyond that, what you also want to have is a common knowledge and language around bias and definitions of bias. Because of course, we all know some of the pitfalls can be one opinion versus another opinion. And so what you want to do is move beyond the opinions and move into understanding of human behavior. And so that everyone is speaking the same language. And so when you decide for example, on whether to do something on your platform, that can be brought to your product equity council. Your product equity council can look at it and say, okay, we have a hypothesis that these are the impacts of doing this. We think that from a revenue standpoint, this could either hurt or help revenue in those regards. But you can also have a lens of like how bias might influence that. And then again, the power of UX research is you can do UX research and understand what role bias is playing in all of that, if it's playing any role at all. So make it sustainable. And you want someone, and the last piece I would say to a product equity council is have someone who is leading it, who really has a solid understanding of the types of bias that exist and can help drive those conversations. So whoever is in charge of that, make sure that they, whether it be yourself, and maybe you decide that you want to educate yourself, make sure that they have a solid understanding. So I am going to conclude just a little bit early, and just say thank you so much for your time. And let's all take the opportunity to have that call to action. And that is how how equity and inclusion could have a true, real business impact in the platform. And using this with a lens of UX or user experience research, understanding who your customers are, gaining deep insights on your customer, and having a lens of digging both into not just qualitative insights through interviews, but also quantitative and understanding behaviors on their platform and the role that bias is playing in all of that. So now I'll open it up for questions if anyone has any.
There's one question: how can one get a role in user experience research without formal role experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually didn't have formal training in UX research. So I went to school at Florida A&M. I got my bachelor's degree in computer information science. And then from there, I went to graduate school, and that's where I sort of discovered this world of human-computer interaction. But I didn't start out as a UX researcher. And so I think what I would suggest is what I did, I can tell you what I did. I went to conferences. So I started out with a conference called UXBA, User Experience Professionals Association. And I did, as a graduate student, I volunteered for the conference. So it was very cheap. I don't know how much it is now. Very cheap back then for me to do that. It was like $150. And I could sit in on workshops. And some of these workshops were taught by industry leading people that were pioneering the field of usability and UX at the time. And I got to sit in on their workshops and learn from them. And I took a lot of notes. Also through my graduate school, I did do some studies in that area, but I didn't have like a formal training. Now it's a little bit different because they do have more schools that are actually teaching that now across the country. Back then they did not. Yeah, those are some of the things. Also, there's a lot of books out there. And for anyone who's interested, you can message me on LinkedIn. I'll usually respond to messages. Just let me just say that you heard this talk. There are lots and lots of books out there that I would recommend reading, and you can start in that way. I also am a leader of an organization here in Austin called Black UX Austin. And what we've done is help a lot of people get first jobs in UX research. So there's some small agencies where they are willing to support people to learn and train them. And so that is an opportunity that I strongly recommend. And if anyone messaged me, I can start to keep an ear out, and I've helped others get some opportunities in that way.
We have another question. Is there a specific book you recommend starting with?
Oh, yes. Understanding your users is probably, I call it it's the best book for UX research. Interviewing your users is another one. I think it's really great. That one's really small to read. It's a quick read. It's a great one to start off with. But if you really want to know all the different methodologies, which I didn't talk about in this presentation, which is a whole nother separate long presentation. There's a different method if you really want to understand all the methodologies out there, from surveys to contextual inquiry to interviews to usability studies, to all the different tools that you can have in your tool belt. Then I definitely would recommend understanding your users.
Okay, another question. How has your HBCU experience shaped your professional experience and the work you do with DE&I?
Hugely. And I didn't realize it at the time, but it has influenced me on so many different levels. And I think now that I'm at Handshake, which, as I mentioned before, is a platform for college students in particular, or early career professionals to find a job, I realized how much that has shaped me and shaped the lens of how I look at things. And I don't necessarily look at things in the same way. I can just give you a concrete example. I was working on a different project a while ago, and someone recommended putting something in copy that I thought was kind of gave the notion that you were paying for applicants. And so I was like, well, I don't want anything in the platform that seems like you're paying for people, right? And so it didn't necessarily occur to them. They were like, oh, and so that's not necessarily HBCU, but just being a Black person, I have a tendency to look at things in a different way. Speaking specifically about HBCU, I'm able to understand or know, for example, on our platform, better about the historically Black colleges than some of my colleagues. For example, looking at data, I'm like, well, Spelman is a very small college. FAMU, for example, Florida A&M, where I went to school, is a much larger college. And so they don't necessarily, not everyone, immediately knows that. For example, they hear typical Black colleges and they think Spelman, Morehouse, Howard, but not necessarily understanding that Spelman and Morehouse are very, very small historically Black colleges, even though, most people have heard of them. So just being able to talk about those things with people and and I'm not saying everybody, because of course we have people that specialize, in historically Black colleges at Handshake. So some people do know that, but there are people that don't, right? So being able to bring that lens to the table and talk about that, and also talk about, some of the things that, some of the ways that we can better support and engage with our HBCUs at Handshake, and how we can better support them. So also bringing that lens to the table.
I don't see any other questions. One last call for questions before we wrap up. Okay. Carmen, do you have any closing remarks?
I just want to say thank you, everyone, for this opportunity and opportunity to speak with everyone. And, the challenges of this virtual world, I wish I could see your faces. And it's just part of, the world that we're in now. But I definitely want to say thank you for this opportunity. And I think as I've moved along in my career, I've really realized the value of having more of us, so Black professionals in roles in product development and design, because we definitely bring a unique viewpoint. We bring something new to the table that is different from everyone else. And it's important that our voice is heard. And it's important that equity and inclusion is a part of not just our personal job as Black professionals, but everyone's job, and bringing everyone along with us, because it is not just for us to carry.
Thank you everyone for joining. We certainly heard some great things from Carmen. I'm sure this group was able to take many nuggets away. Before we break to our next conference sessions, I would like to thank Carmen on behalf of BDPA. Thank you, Carmen, for your time and this wonderful presentation. And again, everyone, enjoy the remainder of the conference. Take care.